Hello, I'm Nino Ship, and it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Gioielli, Associate Professor of Environmental Humanities and Director of the Environmental Humanities Laboratory at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Rob Gioielli is a historian of urban environments whose work focuses on environmental justice, inequality, and the intersections between social issues, sustainability, and environmental politics. He is the author of Environmental Activism and the Urban Crisis, Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, and has published widely in leading journals such as Journal of Urban History, Radical History Review, Global Environment, and Environmental History. He is currently writing a social and environmental history of American suburban sprawl. Dr. Gioielli has held numerous leadership roles in the American Society for Environmental History, serves on the editorial board of Environmental History, and is a former Carson Fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, where he is also Vice President of the Society of Fellows. Before joining KTH, he taught for 12 years at the University of Cincinnati, Blue Ash College, and he was a founding member of the Over the Rhine Museum, serving as a chair of its board for 5 years. Robert, thank you for being with us. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for hosting me today. I'm very excited to talk to you. And first, I want to say thank you for having me to the Institute for these 3 weeks. I'm about halfway through my time here, and it's been great so far, very welcoming, but also some really interesting conversations and discussions about in the environmental history work being done here at this institute, and also some of the larger interesting environmental questions within Ljubljana and Slovenia, both historically and contemporarily. So I'm going to talk today about a book project I have been fighting with for more than 10 years now, right? And fighting with in terms of trying to get it finished. And it is based on experiences within American environmental history, also living within American cities and thinking about race and environment within American cities. But as I've been developing the project, and also especially now that I've based in Europe, working to try to develop some interesting and important comparative and larger lessons here, right? Within American historiography, oftentimes we would not do a very good job of providing a broader framework because we had a big and developed historiography, and so we kind of talk to each other, right? And so I'm trying to move past that. So hopefully we can have some larger thinking here about social and environmental history. All right, so I wanted to frame this in a particular way. And so the question I want to start with, and I won't ask anybody to respond, but I just want us to think about this, right? Which is, where do you live? As in, where do you currently sleep at night, right? I'm not gonna say what your home is, because home is different than where you currently live, right? It can be the same. Why do you live there? Why do you like living there? How much does it cost you to live there? How long have you lived there? Who do you live with? Who owns the house or apartment and or the building or the land beneath, right? So I ask these questions, and I actually intersperse them on purpose because they help get at the complex combination of use value and exchange value within where we live, right? That especially within a capitalist system, our homes, our houses have a lot of use in lots of different ways, but they also have significant particular values, right? And this use has different meanings. It can be keeping us from shelter. It can be protecting us from crime or from danger or the rain or the cold, but there's also social reproduction of various types, basic human functions, going to the bathroom in private. And of course, the exchange value also varies historically depending on especially our national political economy, right? So the context I'm going to talk about today is the exchange value of a home and its importance to the financial security and well-being of millions of Americans within the American context of political economy. But from my experience living in Sweden now for 2 years, this is different, and I'm sure the experience is different in Slovenia. Now, for people who study homes and housing, these first two are very common, right? To talk about the differences between use value and exchange value and these sort of interlocking things. But as an environmental historian, I want to insert this other thing, right? Which is the physical structure that requires upkeep and maintenance. Its complex relationship to the environment, right? One of the fun things about being at KTH now is we have an excellent school of architecture, right? And when you talk to architects, they get really jazzed to talk about the windows, right? And the ceiling material. They think a lot about materials in very complex ways. And as an environmental historian, that's really interesting to me. But then there's also the home, and this is what I'll sort of focus on today, which is the home as part of a larger social, technical, environmental system. Usually that's within the city itself. It could also be within the region. It could also be nationally or internationally, right? Like, how is that home and the use value, the exchange value, the environmental aspects of the home, how is it part of that larger system, both contemporarily and historically? So the starting point environmentally for this project is this. Is when you want to think about sustainability in American life and sustainability in the United States and trying to address climate change, the reality is that the American way of building cities, particularly single-family home, automobile-centric cities that we call sprawling suburbs oftenly, and the United States is not alone in having sprawling cities, account for, and this is from more than 10 years ago, but it still holds up today, 50% of the total U.S. household carbon footprint, right? So this is the city of St. Louis, and I identified here the central part of the city and a far-out suburb called O'Fallon. And the green has a lower carbon footprint, and the red has a higher carbon footprint, right? And this has a lot to do with the way the city is built. It does have a certain amount, it has a good amount to do with class and with income, right? But also, it has to do with race and racial structures, which I'll develop in the argument today. The general argument here is the single-family home is a primary site of energy and resource-intensive consumption. So this is a new home in Canton, Georgia. This is about 1 hour north of downtown Atlanta. And just take a look at that landscape for a minute. I had another slide that sort of had different arrows pointing things out, but you can think about this here. Look at that lawn, right? Do you guys have lawns like that in Slovenia? No, not really, right? Look at that lawn. You know what, that lawn is a particular type of grass that takes a lot of labor, a lot of water, and a lot of chemicals to grow it. That home is a lot of square meters. It takes a lot of energy to heat or cool that home. It's on a particular plot of land, right? Far out from the city, which means the only way to get to that property is by automobile. You can see that garage there to one side, right? This looks like an image, just an image from a Google image search or from a real estate brochure. But in reality, to me, it's showing a very energy and resource intensive system that is also the site of particular racialized and gendered social formation. And I'm just excited that Donald Trump could show up in this, right? So this is before Donald Trump's first re-election campaign in July of 2020. And these were two quotes critical of the Biden administration. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, get too detailed about American housing policy, but basically the Biden administration had passed a regulation, the goal of which was to try to increase housing options for working class and poor people in suburban areas. And Donald Trump was playing into the fear that many white suburbanites have in the United States, that this was a threat to their housing values, and this is a threat to them because of crime. And this was, of course, oftentimes a veiled racialized term, right? And even the way he sort of frames it with gender. Suburban housewives of America must read this article. Biden will destroy your neighborhood and your American dream. I will preserve it and make it even better. And with Trump, there's always something specifically important when he talks about real estate, because he was a real estate developer and he thinks in a very specific way. So that was just a little bit of a preamble or introduction. I'll provide a quick historiographical context here, and then I'm going to pull out more the single-family home as a social, environmental, and technical system. And then the crux of this talk here, we'll be talking at a particular moment in the late 60s and early 1970s. And this is actually the first time I've kind of constructed it historic, narrative-wise in this way. So I'm curious not only for some general feedback about the project and thinking about it, but also sort of this narrative crux. And then finish up with how this moment sort of shapes American cities in the 1970s all the way to 2008 and the financial crisis, but really even to today. All right, so this brings together a number of different literatures. So the first one we would largely call the social histories of energy. And this is a field that's really developed a lot in the past 10 or 15 years, and I find it very helpful because it grounds energy use within social practice, right? And so is anybody here familiar with Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital, right? You're nodding in the back there, yeah. This is a book that historians of climate change and energy transitions and fossil fuel use like to debate and criticize a lot, right? And it sort of sparked a lot of conversation. But I actually find it still very helpful and grounding as a book because what Malm does is he says, if we're gonna look for the most important energy transition in global history, which is when Great Britain adopted coal as the energy source that's going to feed its factories in the early 19th century, right? The story is usually told of a story of technological innovation. We need more energy, so let's innovate and let's get coal-fired factories. Malm says, no, it's about class conflict, that it's grounded in the fact that when the factories were driven by water wheels, they had to locate in certain areas that were oftentimes far away from cities. And that gave workers more power. In order to exert more control over a labor force, capital, of course, wants mobility over the factory, right? Well, if you can move the factory into a city where you have a larger labor force, where you can pit different workers against each other, this can give you more flexibility, right? So he's looking at social origins of the adoption of coal. I still find it convincing. I can see where the critiques come from, but to me, it's still a foundational work. Works like Abigail Harrison Moore's and Ruth Sandwell's. This is a great collection, by the way, if you're interested in this. They look at this and really at the household context, particularly in Great Britain and Canada and Australia, the sort of Anglo sphere, right, of how women in very grounded contexts adapted new energy systems. And then books like, the more like sort of infrastructure history, Chris Jones's Routes of Power, how we embed energy systems. But then also there's a large literature in the United States, and this was what I was trained in really as a social and urban historian, gosh, now almost 25 years ago, is the political economies of race and housing, right? That show how race is embedded within housing policy and the landscape within the United States. And books like David Freund's Colored Property, Monica Prasad's Land of Too Much, which has a lot to do with agrarian policy, actually, I remember. Have you read this?
No.
You should read this. It's really interesting, right? She takes agrarian policy in the 19th century and carries it all the way to housing policy in the late 20th century. It's a bit of a stretch, but she pulls it off. And Keonga Ramada Taylor's Race for Profit. And then a lot of books on suburban consumption, right? The suburban home in the United States as a core site of consumption, but also gendered consumption, class-based, race-based. More recent works that sort of try to embed racial politics and racial conflict and racial hierarchies, most importantly, within the Anthropocene. And so most well-known, Catherine Yusup's Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, work by Laura Polito in the American context, and the work of the Zetkin Collective and some other colleagues looking at sort of more contemporary, what we might call fossil fascism. But then also from a social context, thinking about what we call in the United States race, crime, and the carceral state, right? The politics of race and the politics of criminality and how particular places and the people who live there get constructed as dangerous. And because those places are constructed as dangerous, people don't want to live there, and that assigns value to other places and takes away value from these places, right? Sort of thinking about those sort of inequalities within an urban context. And of course, a lot of this is American historiography, but hopefully it provides a picture of how I'm trying to combine, right? combine and reinterpret from both sides social and environmental history, right? And that's something I've talked with a few folks here, and that's what's exciting to talking with you all here, because a lot of your work is embedded within social history and builds from that, and that's kind of how I approach environmental history. All right, so what I want to do right now is kind of pull apart this house, not literally, but figuratively. So this was a company called Lincoln Homes, and they made in the 1950s in the United States what were known as prefabricated homes, right? These were homes that were built in a factory in like 3 or 4 pieces. Did anyone ever do this in Slovenia? Yeah, I think so, right? I know they did it in Sweden in the 50s and 60s. You build it in pieces, in 3 or 4 pieces in a factory, take it to a site, and then you put it together. It was very popular for a number of years as a lower cost way to afford a suburban home, because the homeowner just had to pay for the lot and some of the utility hookups, and then the home was basically built in the factory. Lincoln Homes was in Pennsylvania, which is in the Midwest of the United States. They were in the western Pennsylvania, Midwest of the United States. A lot of their homes were erected in cities like Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit, close to where I was in Cincinnati for many years. And I picked this home because it's sort of a classic mid-century modern style of American home, right? Of sort of late 1950s. All right, so let's pull apart these components, and they tell us about the social and the material aspects of the home. So the most important is that 2-car garage. And so this is a garage that's separate from the house. If you go back 30 years, American homes, the garage was actually behind the house, because why would you want to have a garage in the front of the house? But here it's becoming a more important part of the actual design of the house. But it tells us a lot about the mobility for the home. The primary way that people are going to get back and forth to that house is by an automobile. By the late 1950s, it's becoming more and more difficult to live in a neighborhood in an American suburb that you can access without having a car, right? It's more difficult to walk in that neighborhood. It's more difficult to ride a bicycle in that neighborhood. It's very difficult to access any amenities or services without an automobile. And this only increases, of course, in later decades. It's not just about, all right, well, we have the house that's on a particular type of street. It's also the design of community. And this is from a colleague of mine. I should have referenced the book in here directly, actually. I forgot about that. I erased that slide. It's by a colleague named Chris Wells, who wrote a book called Car Country. And it's a great example of how to think about social and political factors, build particular types of intensity of technological uses, especially with mobility. And so this is actually a neighborhood in the east side of Cleveland that was built in the 1950s and 60s, Euclid, Ohio. And if you can see here, you can see that the design of the streets, right, to get in and out of these neighborhoods, there's only one way to go in and out, right? There's only one way to go in and out. And if you look at those streets, they're primarily single-family homes. There's not a corner shop or a pharmacy or a tailor or even a school, right? There is some sort of commercial use at the top there. You can see right above the country there, right? But still, this is a design that privileges automobile use. If you know anything about transit economics, it's very hard to actually build a transit system that could economically use this community. So they are called one connection to arterial roads. These are dead ends or cul-de-sacs, as we call them in America. This is also what we call single-use zoning. Even if you wanted to build a small shop or maybe, God forbid, a factory or some other type of business, you couldn't do it. It was illegal, right? Because this was called single-use zoning. It was built primarily for single-family homes. The community is designed for efficient automobile movement, right? Design and zoning make mass transit inefficient, and as we're going to see also, people did not want to have mass transit. It would oftentimes be opposed at every step. Let's look at the rooms of the house. So we have a living room, we have 3 bedrooms, we have a kitchen and a dining room. The rooms in themselves tell us an interesting story about the house as a site of work, as a site of leisure, as a site of social reproduction. Designed for a particular heteronormative nuclear family, a female and a male who would be married, and they would be expected to have anywhere from 2 to 4 children. It was primarily a space of leisure, imagined as a space of leisure for men, right? Because men were the ones who were laboring outside the home for wages. And it was also designed as a space of labor for women. It wasn't promoted in that way, but that's what it was, right? Women who were engaging primary caregiving for children, making meals, keeping the household in various ways. Also, the separate bedrooms is a particular idea of privacy, which enshrines particular ideas about sexuality. Interestingly enough, a lot of the some interesting research on the gay rights movement in the United States that makes claims about privacy and sexuality to claim gay rights in the 1960s and 1970s. So it was an interesting story about sexuality and privacy here as well. You have the lawn and the yard. So these houses were specifically built to have, right, these lawns and yards. They emulated British gardens and estates. They provided a buffer to the street and larger community. The two things I'm really interested in, how this privatizes recreation, right? This is where the kids play. This is where we have the party. This is where we have the barbecue. But this disincentivizes you, disconnects you, from more public recreation and leisure spaces. But it's also creating these new ecologies, right? Lawns create a tremendous amount of pesticide and herbicide use and are very water intensive and take a lot of labor. Another small thing that's also interesting from an energy use perspective is that this style of house, if you were building it from scratch, you would not build this style of house in Cleveland. It's insane because it's a gabled roof. It has a very high ceiling. Cleveland is cold in the wintertime. It snows a lot. They get lake effect snow, right? You can get snows of like half a meter at one go in Cleveland, Ohio. So you would not, this is a home that's built in the style of California or Palm Springs, but these mass-produced type homes were built in this particular ways, right? So another thing about the mass production of homes. Probably to me I wouldn't say unacknowledged part, but the part that's important to wrap into this is the financing scheme for these homes, right? So by the 1950s, the standard mortgage or loan that Americans took out for their homes was a 30-year mortgage, right? A 30-year loan. And that meant that the full cost of the home was amortized equally over those 30 years. And after those 30 years, you would own that home outright. The down payment or earnest money you had to put up for that home was anywhere from 10 to 20%. In the 1950s, if you had been a veteran of World War II in any way, and this was roughly 15 million American men, that down payment could be even lower. These mortgages were backed up through an insurance program provided through the federal government. This was the Federal Mortgage Insurance Program. It was colloquially known by Fannie Mae. And I don't have time to get into this. It involves charts and circles and everything. But basically, the federal government did this in a very indirect way, right? When people talk about housing in the United States, they say, social housing or public housing was, only for certain groups. It was oftentimes by the 1970s constructed to only be for the Black and Latinx poor in certain parts of cities. But America had a huge social housing scheme for working class and middle class white Americans. It just kind of sat in the background in the way the system was constructed. This is what political scientist Susan Metzler calls the submerged state, right? In the United States, lots of social benefits were out of view. And so this creates a political ideology among many Americans that, hey, we're not actually benefiting from the state in any way, right? It's only certain people, oftentimes a racialized group, that's benefiting from the state. So that's a classic picture, right, of public housing there. That's the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis, was, the most representative high-rise public housing system, both in terms of it was considered to be, it was celebrated in the 1950s and then denigrated because of its failures in the 1960s. We could talk more about that as well because I think it's really important to the story. And I know some folks here work on housing. Of course, the other key part here, and we were talking about this before, is these property markets were racialized, right? So in the 1930s, when the federal government sets up these indirect property markets during the American New Deal, these indirect property subsidies, they're interested in maintaining the value of those investments. And so they hire thousands of out-of-work real estate agents and mortgage adjusters all across the country. And they say, we want you to go in all these cities and we want you to tell us what's a good investment and what's a bad investment. And they make thousands and thousands of reports, and they drop these maps, and these maps become famous and very interesting. They're known as redlining maps, right? And there's lots of different types of redlining maps. The ones that are online are from one particular government agency called HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And what they do is they designate certain areas of the city are better or worse investments, and that investment is tied to a number of different factors. But what becomes the most important is race, right? That it does become very important. What it does is it says to banks and mortgage company and other investors that the central part of the city that might have a majority black population, that's not a good investment. That suburban part of the city that has a white population, a middle class or upper middle class white population, that's a good investment. Right? And by signaling, it begins to racialize the property market, right? So it makes it very difficult for homeowners in central parts of cities in order to get investments for their homes. And because of that, what happens to the quality of the housing stock in those central cities? It declines. People can't afford to build new homes. They can't afford to fix up old homes. And then in the psyche of many Americans and in many American institutions, the value of home ownership becomes connected to particular social and racial groups. It also gives a tremendous incentive for suburban whites to try to keep African Americans and other racial and ethnic minorities out of their communities because they see them as a threat to their property values. Race, particularly whiteness, then creates value and builds wealth for individual homeowners. And all of these maps have been digitized in very interesting, excellent website, but in a very interesting way by the University of Richmond. This is one of the great sort of digital humanities projects, digital history projects of the past 10 years. I've written an appreciative, but hopefully a critical article about these maps and the use of them. But if you just Google redlining maps, University of Richmond, you can find them, and they're really fascinating. So what do we have here? A land, resource, and energy-intensive social environmental system, right? Thinking about the single-family home in this way. But it's also a tremendously unstable system. It is constantly under threat and being attacked. And it's being attacked by those who are excluded from the system, right? Directly from the 1950s and 60s by African Americans, and this is a primary source of civil rights activism, but also indirectly attacked, and more directly attacked by the 1960s by women, because it's very difficult for women to get access to these mortgages, right? And this is what a lot of second wave feminism is built around, equal access to credit, right? So this is always an unstable system in a number of different ways, and this key moment of instability is what I'll talk about more. The challenge of the civil rights movement and the response and the control of suburban space in the 60s and 70s. All right, so depending on how you date it, the American civil rights movement, right, at sort of its core begins in 1954, 1955, right, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision or the murder of Emmett Till. As a mass movement, it begins in 1956 or 57, the Montgomery bus boycott, which actually makes Martin Luther King a national leader. And it has roughly 10 years, right? And it goes from being a Southern movement to a national movement to maintain equal access to all sorts of social resources, but also just very much the right to vote and equal and full status in society for African Americans, but then also spreads to other marginalized groups by the late 1960s. The sort of high point or low point of that civil rights movement and the last sort of breakthrough of important civil rights legislation is in 1968 after King is assassinated. There's a wave of protests, rebellions, riots, they're very violent and they all sort of come together, primarily in American cities in Holy Week, the week before Easter, right after King is killed in 1968. this has been, really sort of brought together by historians of the civil rights movement in the past 10 years, right? And identifying more than 100 protests in 1 week span. The most significant ones are in Chicago, Wilmington in Delaware, Baltimore, where I lived and researched for a couple of years, a big deal in Baltimore, right? This really sort of remade the city, and a number of other incidents and events. And this is actually, I just saw this map today. It's very, very helpful for us to talk about this. But the response to this from the federal government is to try to address what civil rights activists had been saying. This is the last, not the last thing, right? But this is the next piece of legislation we need, the next piece of action we need from the federal government is equal access to housing. That a lot of this protest is occurring in cities because African Americans who live in cities, it's not just they don't have equal access to housing, that lack of access and lack of capital and credit means that the neighborhoods they have access to are some of the most decrepit, right? This was my first book was how the type of neighborhoods that people were forced to live in because of discrimination were environmentally destructive, right? That people lived in decrepit houses that were killing them because of air, because of water, particularly because of toxicity. Lead paint was one of the things I wrote about specifically, right? So I won't go into all these things here, but what the Fair Housing Act did is basically said it's much harder to be openly racist in providing housing. And it was considered a key turning point, made it much more difficult to discriminate based on race in selling or renting a home or giving someone a mortgage. But nevertheless, there was lots of power and privilege that white communities had attained within metropolitan America. And they didn't want to give up on that, right? And they were afraid of the threat to their status. They were afraid of the threat to their housing values. So how do you remake white supremacy, or at the very least, white privilege? Well, you control metropolitan space, right? You do this through attempts to control who can live where in the city in a more indirect way. And this had begun, right? These attempts had begun earlier in the 1960s, but they accelerate after the Fair Housing Act because now you can't blatantly or on its face discriminate because of race. The other levers to maintain white power become more limited or no longer available because of the civil rights movement. And U.S. land use and metropolitan development policy is decentralized, make it easier to control. So I had not realized, we were talking about Chicago the other day, and I realized I wanted a map of this, right, to explain this to a non-American audience, which I had not done in the past. So this is metropolitan Chicago. So you can see there on the one side, you see Chicago proper, right? Chicago proper is one city with 1.6 million people? It's a big, 2 point, yeah. So it's pretty big, right? And in the city of Chicago, there is one government that decides what is the urban development policy here, right? Now, obviously, it's big, it's complex, and it's famously kind of corrupt, like a lot of big cities are. But it's one government that decides land use policy, right, for this more than 2 million people. Around the city of Chicago, there are almost 300 local municipal governments. And this is not, I'm using Chicago as an example. This is not unique to American cities. Each one of these cities controls its urban development policy. So this decentralized nature on a governance level allows, right, working class, but especially middle and upper middle class whites to put in policies that are not racially based on their face, right, but are also an attempt to exclude certain groups and in the process continue to inscribe this suburban, social, technical, environmental system. So what I'll do now is give you a couple of examples, right, from the late 60s and early 1970s, two for housing policy and one for mobility policy. And what hopefully we're beginning to see here is the attempt to recreate or continue to perpetuate this energy and resource intensive system, right? That's what I'm trying to do here, right? Is that within American historiography, traditionally it was, well, Americans like space, so that's why we like suburbs, or Americans love their cars. And that's why Americans love the automobile. And it's like, that's not the case, right? We have to understand the full social history of this. All right, so basically 1968 is a turning point, right? From the 1920s roughly to 1968 is what we might call the first urban segregation regime in the United States, where you could blatantly racially discriminate, right? And there's different practices here. I could get into them. You might have heard of them. Redlining being the most well-known, restrictive covenants, different forms of predatory lending, right? So black people didn't have access to credit markets, and so there were lots of ways that they could get a mortgage that were actually very, took advantage of them. Well, then you have a second urban segregation regime, and this is where you're more creative, right? And you use urban development policy. Sorry, the last part got cut off there. I thought I fixed this slide. You use different types of zoning and development restrictions, open space requirements, oppositions to multifamily and social housing, right? You use development policy. It's not going to exclude every black family, but it's going to be much more likely that you're going to maintain a certain level of racial and class homogeneity. So let's look at an example that's going to be in the book, right? And this was kind of the first case study I did for this. So this is social housing in the St. Louis suburbs. This is a secession, right? Seceding from the city. So this picture here is Paul Middlestott, and he worked for a nonprofit corporation, right? An NGO, non-governmental organization that had been created by actually a church group in suburban St. Louis, and the goal was to provide some better access to affordable housing in the suburban St. Louis area. And keep your eye particularly on that picture there, right? What do you see? You see what we might call terraced or semi-detached or small row houses, right? Is this a high-rise? No, right? This is an apartment complex, but it's denser than a suburb, but this is not really what we would call a dense style of urbanism. The church group proposes this development in the St. Louis suburbs in 1969. Local residents are so threatened by this because if it's an affordable housing complex, that means, and they say, hey, this isn't not designed to be an all-black community, but we're not going to discriminate, and we want working people, right, of all stripes to live here. It's subsidized housing, it's not free housing, but we imagine this will be working class people, lower middle class people from all parts of the city. Those people freak out and they say, we have to make sure that this doesn't get approved. They create a new city, they create a new municipality, and they immediately pass a zoning ordinance to say it's illegal to build this structure in our municipality. The U.S. Department of Justice, the federal government, sues and said, you guys are blatantly engaging in racial discrimination. The U.S. Appeals Court upholds that and says, yes, you're blatantly engaging in racial discrimination. But what happens is it drags on for so long, and the economy changes over the course of the 1970s, right? It becomes harder to get a loan, that by the middle of the 1970s, this project is essentially defunct, right? So even though it's obvious they were engaging in racial discrimination, the project actually is eventually built about 7 or 8 years later. It's a really interesting story. But what you see now here is a playbook or a pathway for different local governments, right? And there's hundreds of these stories. They say, as long as we pass the zoning and development restrictions in certain ways, and we don't obviously use racial language, and that was the problem they used here. They'd obviously use racial language in the beginning. We can get away with, these requirements. Or we can just delay and delay and delay by using the legal system. What were people threatened by? They were threatened because they saw social housing, right? Multifamily housing, public housing, as an incubator and vessel for crime and family destruction, right? And so we have to take what they say seriously, because that's important. So these are pictures of two, infamous social housing complexes from Chicago. Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes have since been demolished, very recently, actually, or relatively recently, actually. And then there's also the Pruitt-Igoe homes, where existed just in central St. Louis. Now, look at this image back here. Sorry, right? Look at that, right? Typical suburban American apartment complex. There are quotes. I have multiple quotes from people in Blackjack that said, I don't care what you tell me. I don't care if it's going to be for, firefighters and teachers and lower middle class people with good jobs. I look at those homes and I see a future Pruitt-Igoe, right? They assigned social failure, crime, criminality, drugs, racialized crime and criminality with all forms of multifamily housing, thus further inscribing a particular type of low-density single-family home. I'll do this example real quick. Similar example from suburban Boston, where there was an attempt to build a similar style of social housing complex by a non-governmental organization. Interesting here is the community members actually said, we don't want you to build that there because it's going to hurt the marsh, right? And so they actually used an environmental argument. They said, no, we want to protect the environment here. And this is an interesting example, right, where you see the environmental values clash with the social values. And so they're able to oppose this, right? You can see the one picture there. They have the nice little wetlands, and they say, this is going to destroy these wetlands, and so that's not going to be good. And so eventually, this is a very small project, but this small project happens over and over again in different parts of the United States. So in addition to controlling housing, you also need to control mobility, right? Because we're inscribing a particular type of suburban development onto the metropolitan landscape. It's important to remember that a lot of the civil rights movement is about controlling mobility and access to mobility, right? Arguably the most famous civil rights activist after Martin Luther King is Rosa Parks, right? This is her picture, her famous mugshot for when she is arrested for sitting in the white section of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And there's a lot of symbolic value here to Rosa Parks, but at the end of the day, it was about access to mobility, right? And there's a number of different protests, famous ones, the Freedom Riders, other protests that were about equal access to public transit of various types across the United States. And these are actually the earliest forms of, some of the earliest civil rights protests were to public transit. And the part I'm leaving out here actually is what's very interesting in places like Montgomery and Atlanta and places in the South. Once blacks got equal access to public transit, what did whites do? Stop riding public transit, right? And this leads to the further intensification of automobility. These protests are successful, but after the 1960s, public transit in the United States becomes increasingly racialized and delegitimized, right? And so the example here I'm going to use quickly is from Atlanta. The Atlanta system is known as MARTA, or the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. And up until very recently, really up until the pandemic, the MARTA was sort of a watchword in suburban Atlanta for something you don't want in your community. We don't want MARTA in our community. This was a vote no to MARTA expansion, March 19th, 2019 Facebook page. And the argument many suburban Atlantans use is that MARTA will bring crime to your community. What's interesting, though, is the racialized and racial history of the MARTA story. So MARTA was proposed in the early 1960s by the white corporate and political leadership in Atlanta. They wanted we were talking about this the other day, I think, right? They wanted a transit system that could appeal to the white middle class suburbs and that would not directly compete with the automobile system, but would provide an alternative to reduce automobile traffic, right? And this is how a lot of post-war transit systems were built in the United States. Has anyone ever been to Munich? All right, next time you're in Munich, think about where the Tunnelbahn, that's in Sweden, sorry, Tunnelbahn is the same actually, but where the U-Bahn in Munich is built and how it's built. It was consciously built to be a system, because remember, Munich is also the home of BMW. It was consciously built to be a transit system that would not get in the way of automobility, right? It's going to be underground. It's not going to directly compete with the automobile. It'll just be an alternative, but we still want automobiles. Same thing in Atlanta and a lot of places in the middle of the 20th century. In order to get the funding to approve the MARTA system, there has to be a citywide vote to approve a new tax structure. In that citywide vote in the late 1960s, black voters actually say, no, we don't want to approve this MARTA system. And the white power structure traditionally had said, but you guys ride public transit. Why don't you want to approve MARTA? They say, we understand what this is going to be. This is a rail system for the white suburbs, and you guys have been disinvesting in the bus system for decades. The bus system was privately owned. It was an exorbitant fare. It had been going through a sort of death spiral of usability for 20 years. So eventually, the leaders in power in Atlanta say, all right, here's what we're going to do. If you pass this new system, if you agree to fund the rail system, we'll also fund the bus system. And this works. And for the 1970s, as they're building out the rail system, the bus system gets a lot of money and is reinvigorated. But by the 1980s in Atlanta, and we'll talk about some of the other social components here that go into this and political and economic systems, right? The transit, bus, and rail is increasingly being racially delegitimized, right? And this is a picture of the director of MARTA from the early 1980s. This is an article in the New York Times, Racial Roadblock Seen in Atlanta Transit System. And increasingly, you see white suburbanites in Atlanta when there's proposals to expand the system into the suburbs, right? They're consistently saying, if we expand this, this is going to bring crime into our suburban areas, right? And this is not a small issue. This is how people imagine this. A bumper sticker sometimes seen on Cobb County as a suburban county, right? Share Atlanta crime, support MARTA, right? These are just dozens of examples and legal decisions from American cities in the 1970s that work to ensure that a certain type of home and urban development regime is the most privileged and desirable, right? This is that single-family suburban home. So this is me in front of the most famous, arguably the most famous, single-family American suburban home from the 1970s. Does anybody know what this is what this house is from? Has anyone ever seen the TV show or heard of the TV show, The Brady Bunch? So this is the Brady Bunch home. It was not filmed there, but this was the home that was used on the outside in the introduction to the show. It's in the San Fernando Valley of California. When I was doing research for this project there a couple of years ago, my friend said, let's go see the Brady Bunch house. And we could only hop out, take one picture because they're sick of people taking pictures. So if you stand there for more than 30 seconds, they yell at you and call the cops on you. But all right, so a few more key themes, and then we'll sort of rush to the housing crisis. So what is happening here? This is giving a set of tools to reinscribe this very energy and resource intensive and racialized system onto the American metropolitan landscape. But there's other things happening right in the 1980s. So you have people continually believe they have proof that the city is a site of endemic racial violence and social decay. So you have the crack epidemic. You have gang violence, the visions of family breakdown within urban African-American communities. You have the economic and social insecurity of the neoliberal economy, right? You know, in the United States, we don't say neoliberal, we just say Reaganism, but that's what it was. And Reaganism, of course, brought severe cuts in social provision, right? Which exacerbated the social dislocation of the cities. The first homelessness crisis in America is in the early 1980s. Why is there a homelessness crisis? Because there were tens of thousands of Americans with mental health disorders that had been living in institutions. And there's a push to deinstitutionalize them because a lot of these institutions were not very well-run places, right? They were kind of poorly run mental asylums. But once they were deinstitutionalized, there was not the requisite social support provided to them, right? Severe cuts in mass transit, housing, and social welfare. And of course, a recommitment to the political economy of inexpensive petroleum, right? That's what the first Gulf War was about. We kind of, in the United States at least, we forgot about that first Gulf War. That's what it was about, right? In this world, what does a suburban home provide? It provides a safe and secure dwelling, an appreciating asset. Because of that, it provides social security, because after that 30-year mortgage, you own that home, and that's an important financial investment. It's state subsidized. Because the schools are good, it provides social reproduction, and you have local control and security. Also good health and environment, so it's good public health. So the suburb is what David Harvey would call a social fix. This is the Marxist urban geographer, right? So he talks about the spatial fix of capitalism, originally in an article on the Geographic Review from 2001. It's an idea he developed in writings on neoliberalism in the early 2000s, right? And he was thinking specifically on a landscape level, but ultimately when you look at Harvey's writings, he had talked a lot about sort of spatial fixes going back to his first important major work, Social Justice in the City, in 1972. So Irvine is in metropolitan Los Angeles, right? And so there's downtown Los Angeles, there's Irvine and the Mission Viejo neighborhood in the southern part of Orange County. Irvine is a master plan developed community from the 1960s and 1970s. Irvine's going to be an important part of the book here. Because this system is unstable but desirable, you have to limit your risk. You have to limit the risk of asset depreciation. You have to limit the risk to social reproduction. You have to limit risk to health and well-being. And who are the biggest perceived threats to that risk? The presence of black and brown people. So what do? You make sure that you maintain a single-family home, automobile-intensive community. And you want to make sure that you keep black and brown people out of that community, and that means opposing social housing. Mission Viejo is one of the most privileged parts of southern Orange County, and in the early 2000s, they want to build a low-rise social housing complex. When they proposed that, people said at the public hearing, Mission Viejo is in danger of building a ghetto in this city, right? And so this is people continue to oppose social and affordable housing. They oppose public transit just like they have in Atlanta for decades, and privileging the privately owned single-family suburban home as a legitimate form of lifestyle. All right, so there's a few thoughts to how this brings us to the housing crisis. I could talk more on that, but I've gone a little over time, but not too bad, right? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's perfect.
All right, excellent. So looking forward to discussion and questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and the floor is open for questions.
Well, I have a few, actually. First of all, whose house is that in Canton, Georgia? You don't have to answer that.
That was just a Google, like I picked these oftentimes I'll pick representative neighborhoods.
It's just a random house.
And just Google Street View, and just, screenshot. So I'm sure I'm invading someone's privacy, but, and now it's on YouTube. So someone will find it at some point, yeah.
I have two serious questions.
Yeah.
One, and maybe I'm reading the present moment into the past, but you opened with the differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Talking about the housing project in St. Louis, it was kind of surprising to see that it was a staunchly Republican Nixon's Justice Department that tried to stop this local racist initiative.
Yep.
So I'm wondering, are there any historically observable correlations between the housing policies and maybe delineations along party lines that you will or you can talk about?
That's
one. And then the second, you're in a fortuitous situation of kind of exploring the evolutionary arcs of these cities.
Yep.
And you, by the virtue of going there to research, you see the situation
right
now. So my question would be, do you see anything changing, or do you foresee anything changing, and why not?
Yeah.
This is going to be a book, and I always like when books have like an epilogue or a coda or something. So maybe you can say something about the America of today.
Yeah, that's good.
And where we are.
Yeah. In terms of the early 1970s, right? It's an interesting historical moment because you have, Nixon is in many ways sort of the epitome of new conservatism, right? But he still has a lot of policies that we would consider to be reflective of the moment, but also reflective of a more moderate to even liberal republicanism, right, of the late 60s and early 1970s. So his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development was George Romney, right, who was the governor of Michigan, who ran an automobile corporation, and so he was more of a middle-of-the-road Republican. He doesn't sort of fit within the arch conservative narrative. And so there was an attempt by Romney in that administration to try to really enforce these fair housing laws. the critique that other colleagues who've dug more into this has said they only go so far, right? And there's basically, they go as far as they get serious pushback, and Nixon says, okay, hold off here, right? We've done enough to show that we're trying to shore this up. But there are definitely, there's more, you can get in the weeds here more about sort of what the limits of this is, so this is an example that kind of makes them maybe look a little bit better than they were. But no, I think the exact, I'm going to carry the story up exactly right to the housing crisis. But then there is the story of America, say, of the past 15 years, and attempts to try to counteract this racialized sprawl. And some are successful, right, in terms of trying to reinvigorate certain neighborhoods of cities in certain ways. I think efforts to bring density to cities have been more successful over the past 25 years, and to try to alleviate the energy intensiveness of sprawl. But they haven't been attuned to the class and racial aspects of it now. So a lot of these projects to reinvigorate urban cores themselves exacerbate gentrification, right? So they actually reinscribe race into the metropolitan landscape. And so gentrification then oftentimes, and you see this in a lot of metropolitan areas where working class and poor communities of color, Black, but also Latinx, are then pushed out into suburbs, right? And pushed out into into older suburban areas, right? So there's sort of a bit of a changing landscape rather than this sort of classic Chicago model of sociology, center and core. So, but, also I find Los Angeles and even parts of Chicago really interesting, and other big cities, right? Because you do have attempts to try to create multiracial democracy in parts of the metropolitan landscape, right? In places where it's sort of tenuous and working, and some places not working. So, there's lots of different ways to go with that, but yeah, it's interesting. Thanks. Yeah.
It's me. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for linking together or pointing at such an organism, a system. Really, it's environmental, social, economical, political. It's really very complex. Really pointed out the multi-layeredness. I think on one hand it's wonderful. You kind of open up another aspect how to look on environmental issues and on the intertwinement. On the other hand, it was, for me, it's a lot to swallow and digest because it's very thick, it's very dense.
Yep.
So I have maybe 2 or 3 questions, I don't know yet. I think it's really very interesting to look at the housing, the mobility, and the transport, automobile industry, like public transport infrastructure, with the civil rights movement, which is really very U.S. story. Because I'm trying to think how can we maybe conceptually just move to other countries and to other histories. If I understood that well, like the role of automobile industry, this is something that I haven't thought about. This how it plays such a big role in the lobbying of the automobile industry, how it can create and develop particular public transport. Public transport is very bad in the States. And this is what you would like to say, that it was a very important political role, it was strategy, it was a rational thing. Would you explain this in a kind of friction, that different interests come together and they're intertwined?
I would say the latter, right? I would say the latter in terms of, this talks a lot about housing, because kind of the political economy of housing is central to the argument in a lot of ways. So I talk less about mobility here in this version of it, because then it would got to be more complex, but you're exactly correct.
Because the houses that you showed and what is showed well is the design. It's designed in that well that you need to have a car.
Exactly.
And then of course the whole infrastructure is scattered.
Yeah.
So I haven't thought about that, how urban planning can support one sector or one industry.
Exactly.
In such a manner.
Yeah. No, that's exactly correct. I mean, and that's kind of the prehistory of this story, and that's what the Car Country book does, right? In terms of how the suburban development complex, we might call it, from the 1920s in the United States through the 50s, builds in sort of in cooperation in many ways with automobile-centric planning and automobile development in the United States? And I mean, that's a good question, actually, in terms of that's something I'll need to make sure I pull apart a little bit more in the role of, in the United States, it's still within the historical literature and especially within the popular imagination. Even for people who are critical of automobility, there's oftentimes almost like a conspiracy level of this is what the automobile corporations did, right? Has anyone, you probably say no. Has anyone ever seen the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Yeah.
Okay, right? So the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit is about how they're going to destroy, it's a ridiculous movie and it's actually very entertaining, but the sort of narrative arc of the movie is based on a real story, which is how General Motors and other automobile corporations essentially supposedly conspired to destroy the tram and streetcar system in Los Angeles and the rest of the country, right? This wasn't really a conspiracy. It was something they obviously did. They bought up these tram systems and then turned them into bus systems because they'd rather sell bus systems. But in reality, it discounts why people, the story, this sort of conspiracy level story, discounts how these transit systems were not very well run. And people saw automobility as a very viable alternative to a transit system, right? I mean, think about it here in Ljubljana. How many people, if they had really, really good transit system where you lived, would you own a car? Maybe, maybe not, right? I mean, that's the thing. And so in the United States, it's the same thing. It's not just the automobile. You're exactly correct, right? It's not just some sort of push from the automobile corporation. It's also just the other different factors and the fact that people saw a lot of benefit and value to automobility, right? And it wasn't just about an American love of cars. It was about the convenience that it provided for certain people. I don't know if that's answering your question at all, but I thank you for raising that because that's something I want to make sure I put in here.
Definitely, you can find different ways how to attract people. How people could find that appealing.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I think it's really this urban planning and as you said at the beginning, this is the problem also in Slovenia as the transport, the mobility causes great problems in Slovenia also regarding the emissions. And so many people drive to Ljubljana, so it's a problem with traffic jams, with air pollution, and yes.
Yeah.
So exactly, another question I have is regarding the trade unions, because you didn't mention them, and you mentioned the protests and the critique that was raised. And do you see that trade unions also for housing and more equality and access to housing and to mobility, or trade unions was not an actor in developing this story at all?
In this, they were not. It's interesting. The trade unions themselves were a little bit conflicting, right? In terms of seeing them as sort of an actor for social justice. And the trade unions, probably the biggest and most important trade union in the United States in this period is the UAW, the United Automobile Workers, right? And so the UAW as a union is pushing more for social equality, right? And is trying to provide broad-based, more social, and probably the most social democratic union in the 1960s. But the UAW's white members are firmly embedded with the benefits of this system, and so that's where you get a bit of this contradiction. Yeah, you get this conflict here, right? And that sort of builds from an older generation of literature here, right? The sort of most famous book about this is Origins of the Urban Crisis by Tom Segura about Detroit, and he deals a lot with trade unions. And thanks for bringing that up because that's something I probably want to pull back in here a little bit because there's some pretty good research on it. And trade unions were heavily involved in any discussion over or debate about housing construction. because the trade unions were, the construction trades were, trade unions in American cities were more conservative, and they were always sort of two minds when it came to various types of construction projects. You know, they wanted to see more construction projects that would benefit them and their members, but they were also more conservative white members, and so they didn't want to see any threat to the privileges they had maintained in housing. So that's a good question. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was curious to what extent this kind of critique of automobile-centric urbanism, which we know today, was it already in some form present during these debates in the periods you're talking about? Or was it primarily just seen as an aspirational form of culture, which presented some kind of barrier of entry?
It was actually, it was. And it's interesting that you say that, right? Because I saw this, because in the previous research I wrote about anti-highway protests, right? And so in the 1950s and 60s in American cities, you know, a lot of Central American cities were destroyed to construct huge highway projects, right? And sort of it was combined with urban renewal, and it was really destructive to a lot of cities. And so I wrote about these as environmental movements, as sort of, you know, protecting the urban environment in lots of different ways. And I didn't fully integrate that they were being critical of car culture to a certain degree, right? But they didn't necessarily have the framing or the tools to think about it as fully critiquing car culture. So it's definitely there. It's definitely there, but I would say that's a good point as well. I would say the policy tools and the understanding of these issues is not necessarily available in a way that maybe is in Western Europe. I see this in Western Germany and, you know, places I studied, right, in Sweden, Western Germany, where there is a little bit more support for public transit and funding available for public transit, and people see this as a possibility. And also a lot of the available critique for automobility comes from, it's sort of a tenuous cross-class and cross-racial coalition. And it's able to unite over certain types of highway construction that's particularly destructive to a city. But it never really builds enough to build a larger critique. So, yeah, thanks. That's a good question. That's a good question.
Anyone else? Someone on the internet? Okay, then maybe I have one question. Maybe it's a little bit out of context, but anyhow. So you showed a public transport in Atlanta. I have one question. So what's the situation today? Who is using it today? And maybe even a broader question. What's the future of the public transport?
Oh, yeah, not well right now. So the transit system in Atlanta was for decades thoroughly racialized, right? And this is similar to lots of American cities. And it was primarily African Americans in the cities that would use the public transit system. But it was also, and this is important to note, it was intersectional in terms of not just African Americans, but also poor and lower levels of the working class, right? Because the level, this is what happens. This is actually an important part of the story that I didn't fully flesh out. That gets to, you know, fleshing out the transit aspects of the story, is that there's such a decline in support and funding for transit. By the time you get to the 1980s, even transit planners and public officials in most American cities think of transit, and especially transit riders, as in two different groups, right? They've naturalized automobility so much, they said there's two different groups of riders. There's the people who have to ride public transit because they can't afford a car, or maybe they can't drive a car because they're elderly or disabled. And then there's the people who ride public transit by choice. And so what happens is a lot of that service that's being provided in public transit in American cities is focused on serving those people who have to ride it, right? And when you have a system, especially in a very stratified social structure like America, when you have a system that's primarily constructed for a racialized group and a poor group, right? Is that going to be a well-run system? No, it's crap, right? Doesn't have new infrastructure, doesn't have good signaling, it's expensive, the services are regular. So in lots of cities, it's not just, it's not a racial split, it's a race and class split. You only ride the bus if you have to ride the bus. And the second you can afford a car or get a ride in a car, you do that, right? And so that's one of the and that sort of gets to the problem of transit in the United States. It's still in most American cities, larger American cities, primarily east and the Midwest, that have what we call legacy systems, right? They have more riders of multiple classes, but still to this day, efforts to build new systems in the United States believe, all right, we have two classes of riders. We have the riders who have to ride us, and then we need to build a system that's going to just try to convince white middle class people to ride public transit, right? And what that means is, in many places, it's an overinvestment in certain communities. It's an overinvestment in rail systems, which are really expensive, and an underinvestment in bus systems. So an example I'll use in the book is, this wasn't a train union. It was the bus riders union in Los Angeles in the 1980s and 1990s. And it was a social justice group, and it came about from Black, Hispanic, and Asian transit riders. They were the 90% of the bus riders in Los Angeles. And these were a lot of folks who worked in the service industry, they were cleaning crews, a lot of them worked in the garment industry, and they rode the bus every day. And the city was looking to build a new rail system, and they're like, no, you don't need to invest billions of dollars in a rail system, you need to fix the bus system, right? But that sort of class and racial divide that exists in transit, right, is still there. So that's part of the challenge I don't think has been overcome.
Thank you. So does anyone have any more questions?
Maybe just like I know that like global warming and emissions, environmental, ecological policies is not a thing in the States right now.
Not on a national level, it's still on a local level.
It does not exist at all.
Yeah.
As a problem, but still, do activists and those who do fight for this question, do they address the public transport as a very important, as this is what you showed, how the mobility and this automobile that people drive with cars, this causes a lot of emissions. This is also a problem in Slovenia.
Yeah.
And for example, public transport and the organization of public transport and the way that we don't have the right train system, but also the way how buses are organized within the city. And also regarding the ownership, who owns bus companies are on the market, is a very important issue. Still maybe not addressed enough, tackled enough, but it is. Public transport is something to build on.
Yeah.
Not to get away from it.
No. I think it's improved somewhat in the past few years. It improved somewhat in terms of the discussions around public transit, and I think improved at least on a local level during the pandemic in terms of understanding, the sort of idea of who an essential worker was and what that really meant, and who has to use the transit system, because a lot of transit systems were under threat because of lack of ridership. So I think there's more of a robust understanding of that at the local level. There's not necessarily funding as there should be, because the problem in the United States is, and this is actually another part of the transit system discussion I left off of the presentation, is historically since the 1950s, the federal government subsidizes the road system, but doesn't subsidize the public transit system.
Exactly.
Right? And so a lot of that money has to come from, and there's fits and starts for public subsidies for public transit, but it's not nearly at the level of the road system. But I think there is a growing recognition that robust public transit for everyone, right, among certain activists is necessary, to address the climate crisis. But I think there's not an understanding that we also have to address the housing system, right? So, you know, I would see, if I took off the historian hat and put on the policy hat, I would say there's not enough of an understanding that all these things work together, right? We have to build completely different cities, and they have to look completely differently in order to make them more sustainable cities. And, you know, what was sold to Americans for the past 10 years up through the Biden administration was, hey, you can have your cake and eat it too. And I shouldn't say just Americans, because you see this all over Western Europe, right? Which is that, hey, we can solve the climate crisis and you don't have to give up your car. There's this great thing called the electric car, right? And this will solve all of our problems, right? And sort of this, and not just the electric car, but to sort of a techno-modernity, right? That means that we don't have to fundamentally adjust ways of living. I'm interested in, of course, how we build and live in our cities. And so I think it's starting to change because people are also thinking about, you know, sort of more informed scholars and activists are seeing what even if Biden had or Kamala Harris had been able to win re-election and continue the climate policies that they had put, the Biden administration put in place, people are beginning to see, you know, much like in Europe, right, that even the electric automobile is tremendously resource intensive, right? Lithium mining and all the other resources that it uses, right, and the way it connects and makes us dependent upon a high intensity electric grid in a lot of ways. So I think there's some folks who are shifting in terms of that thinking, but it's very challenging because you see it in Sweden, right? You see it in Sweden in terms of there's a little bit of an exhaustion pushback with the green transition, and some of it is, hey, I got an electric car, so I'm good. You know, it doesn't take. This is what a lot of my other colleagues are working at KTH is thinking about what are the hiccups and challenges, right, from a personal, intellectual, psychological to a structural and systematic point of view.
It's a very pungent ideological issue still.
Yep.
If you isolate a location like Chicago, you know, it's an overwhelmingly positive sentiment now towards mass transit.
Yep.
But now, day-to-day, you know, operations, it boils down to the price.
Yeah.
People want an expansion of the system, but at the price of more than $1 billion per mile for the Red Line project. How do you do it?
Yeah, how do you do it? Yeah, and that's the thing, right? At the end of the day, because of the funding system, it's got to come from the state or the city, and
there's too much money.
There's too much money, right? And the question is, I don't know the Chicago example, but that's the thing too, is that is there an alternative that's not the expansion of the Red Line, right? Is it an alternative that is a more robust bus system, you know, that can provide that? Because rail costs money, and that's another thing. This gets into the weeds with transit planners, right? And the United States building rail systems is like, and even if you adjust for wages and sort of cost of living and everything, it's like 3 times more expensive to build metropolitan rail in the US than it is in Europe. Not counting China, right? Like just because of the way it's done, because of the contracts, because of the design, because of the lack of expertise, it's just that much more expensive in the United States. Yeah. So.
Okay, so if there is no any more questions, I think we will conclude here. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.